Hey, it's Steve from iHeartRadio, and I'm joined today by Gord Sinclair of the Tragically Hip. It's awesome to meet you.
Nice to meet you too, Steve. Thanks for having me in.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this interview for the past couple weeks because I saw you guys like a million times when you were playing, and you were such a fixture. You know, like Canada Day
Sure.
concerts. I saw you at Yonge and Dundas Square for free when you did the opening for the Leafs.
Cool.
Caught you at Barry Molson Center. And it feels like Canada, because I do consider you guys to be walking Canadiana,
Sure.
maybe hasn't had an opportunity to talk to some old friends that we'd like to talk to more, and we understand why we can't. But, how is everybody?
Yeah, well, everyone's lives has changed quite considerably. We were in the Hip, living and breathing together for almost 40 years. And it becomes this huge part of your life, started off as young men loading up the van to crisscross across this country, and that process of touring made us who we are as musicians and as songwriters, but also as people. We got into this routine where, we would write a record, record a record, release a record, tour a record, take a couple months off, and repeat. And that was our lives, And now we all find ourselves at this stage of our life where, myself, for instance, where that's not going to happen anymore, and a big part of it was the ability to have that creative outlet and that opportunity to write and make music. And as an artist, that there's a compulsion there. It's very, very self-indulgent, but it's also you're compelled to be creative, and to put it out there, and that's why I find myself sitting here talking to you, though as much as given my choice, I wish things hadn't happened the way they had happened, and that the Hip were still going strong. Do you know what I mean?
I think that everybody feels that way. We were actually discussing before this how the Hip, I don't think I've ever met anybody that doesn't like the Hip.
Sure.
And it's like I said before, it's because you are Canadiana. There was this connection. Lyrically, there were landmarks from across the country, different use of symbols, things that maybe only Canadians could cling to. And I think that's why that connection was the way that it was.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's a big part of who we were. We come from a long and amazing Canadian tradition. You think back to Rush and going back as far as Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks. And, again, with Neil Peart's recent passing, it drives the point home that what we enjoy here in Canada, certainly as a musician or as a comedian, a performing artist of any kind. I mean, this is a really difficult country to tour. It's very broad, very wide, very deep, and to invest your time and your energies to become a performing musician, to be an artist in Canada, you have to go all in. You have to pile into the van in the middle of February and drive 8 hours to get to Moose Jaw on a Tuesday night so you can play the next gig, so you can do it again. And that's what Canadian musicians do. That's what makes Canadian music what it is. And somewhere along the way, this is what we all share in common, from getting from Sudbury up to Kenora, you're looking out the window with your bandmates, or, you get to a greater sense of what Canada is. All us musicians and all the comedians that perform and stuff, we all have a Newfoundland story. We're getting snowed in on the rock story. We all have that moment of stopping in the middle of the prairies in the middle of the winter and experiencing the Northern Lights for the first time, and that's what unites us as a country on a cultural level, and it's cool that people resonate still with that, and I experienced it myself listening to Rush's songs, and fellow artists that I travel with, and there's a knowing glance amongst Canadian artists that, oh yeah, I was there too, I've been there. It's cool.
It's a very interesting point because, like you said, there is this diversity across the country, and then amongst that, there is this subtext of commonality. But taking a look at your new record, Taxi Dancers, I listened to it a little bit, what you've put out at least. The rest, I guess, is coming on February 28th. And you can feel the influences in the music from your days with the Hip.
Sure.
Do you think that that's something that you did deliberately, or is it subconsciously just the same music you wanted to continue to put out?
Yeah, I think there's certainly there are elements of the Hip in there, because I was in the Hip for so long. We had a great songwriting style within the group where like a lot of bands, it's funny, I find myself back to where I started, but when we first put the group together, it was like, hey, we're playing covers and whatnot, but I've got a song and it goes like this, and it's like, oh, cool song. And then all of a sudden you become an original act and guys are throwing in their songs. And very early on, we learned that, wow, Gord is an amazing lyricist, great singer, great lyricist though. So maybe we should be writing our songs together, and that's how we kind of evolved. So I, rather than write my own songs, give them to the band, I would throw in an idea, and then we would develop collectively as a group, and that's how we developed our own thing. So it just stands to reason that that musical element that I would have brought to the hip is still within me. Like, it's not like I'm going to set out, do my first solo work and try to make a hip hop record,
Of course,
or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
So it's in there, and I've been influenced as a songwriter and as a musician because I played with the same guys for 40 years. So that creeps in, and certainly the way I tackle trying to write a lyric and write a song. I worked my entire career with someone who I consider to be one of the finest rock lyricists ever, and so it ups the bar. There's an expectation that I have with myself because of working with this cat for so long.
Despite the fact that you've been in music now, like you said, for 40 years, writing these songs, being a part of these songs, did you feel then a pressure as this being your first solo venture, or are you like, I've done this, I've got decades under my belt?
No, you always put the pressure on yourself, and that was a great thing about being in the hip. It would have been very easy earlier on for us to rewrite New Orleans is Sinking over and over again. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But we always, because there was 5 of us and we were always pushing forward. And Gord really drove that engine for us, like trying new things and pushing yourselves creatively to get out of your comfort zone, and I think that's what contributed us being able to endure as long as we did. And I still have that in the back of my mind always when I'm trying to write. Is this good enough? Is this, avoiding the, as Gord wrote, avoid trends and cliches,
Mm-hmm.
and so that's what you do. You set a high bar for yourself and try to get over it when you're being creative.
Do you have then ideas that aren't up to snuff or up to your standard when you finally get them developed and you look at them and you say, I don't really think this one's going to make it, and you set it aside?
Totally. And we used to go through that in the group all the time too, where you're throwing stuff out there, and you think it may be gold, and the other guys are like, meh,
Mm-hmm.
and you move on to something else. And I catch myself doing that all the time. I write. I try to play a little bit of the guitar and write almost every day. It's what I do to relax, and it's what I do to express myself creatively. And you stumble on stuff that's really great, but those real moments of inspiration, that you feel compelled to developing them and finish them. Those are the moments that you wait for as an artist.
Is that something you carried over also with this album? Because I was actually on your Instagram a couple of days ago, and your most recent post is an album of photos. And below it, once you get below, there's a quote, and into the caption, there is a ton of names in there where it's thank you for contributing to this. And it sounds like you probably used the same synergy that you used to have in the hip on this solo venture where you had people you could lean on.
Yeah, very, very much so. I'm a big believer in the power and the importance of collaboration in any artistic adventure. It's like and I benefited from that. I know as a writer, playing with the guys as long as I did made me a better songwriter, made me a better musician, so it just stands to reason. I have all these great friends that I've met over the years, John Angus MacDonald and James McKenty, who I made this record with, that you can only as an individual take a song so far. And then you get to the point where you play it for somebody else and you turn it over to them, with trust, love in your heart, and say, how can we make this a better song, And that's what we always incorporated in the hip all the time, and that's what I was able to lean on these guys now. And you try to remove the ego from it. You do remove the ego from it, and you can have an honest conversation about how do we make this a better piece of music, a better piece of art.
When you go through that process, you said you were still playing the guitar and writing songs every day. Post Gord Downie, post the Tragically Hip,
Yeah.
was music something that provided you a catharsis?
Yeah, very, very, very much so. after we finished touring, I was still writing and continued to write. I wrote a song for Gord while he was still with us, still very sick, that I've included on this record. I've always used writing as an emotional crutch for myself, but after Gord died, it was a difficult time. I continued to try to write, but I didn't feel I had adequately expressed what I was feeling. And about a year ago, at Christmas time, our old road manager, a guy named Dave Powell, who was the sixth guy that got into the van with us when we were young men to head across the country. He was our road manager. He also died, and so about a year ago in February, I wrote a song that's on the record called "In the Next Life." That I think I finally got to the point where I was able to decently articulate what my feelings were about these two friends who are gone. I mean, I'm in my mid-50s, so I'm at the age where I'm losing parents now and losing friends and losing lots of musician friends of mine who are much younger than I am. And you realize over the course of your life, you have this great fortune to intersect with these people, sometimes for brief periods of time, sometimes for an entire career, but you always stand the possibility of losing them, whether a relationship breaks up or in our case, people die. And you fill that hole with the memory and that love that you felt for them and take the strength from that and then take the next step forward. And I can honestly say, Gord would not have wanted any of us in the group to ever stop playing, ever stop writing, ever stop being creative, and so you gingerly move forward, And once I wrote that song, I kind of realized, okay, now I see where this is all going. It kind of makes sense now to do a record, and let it out.
So I've never gone through that transitional period in my life, but my parents are going through it. So I've had the opportunity to kind of see it secondhand. And I've been reading these articles talking about how you have mentioned that this album was largely reflective on kind of exactly what you just touched on.
Sure.
In that sense, would you say that this is a farewell album of sorts, or is it really just a stepping stone into another part of your musical career?
Yeah, I don't know that it's a farewell record. I think it will certainly touch on that idea because, love and loss are something that we will all have in common at some point. I mean, we're mortals, and we share that mortality. Right? At some point in our lives, we will all experience loss. If we're fortunate, we will also all experience love. Mm-hmm. The loss of which, whether it's the end of a relationship or the loss of a loved one, can even be more difficult to deal with, right? We don't talk about that enough in Western culture, the inevitability of that. Gord wrote a song called "The Inevitability of Death." I mean, it's something we talked about in the group all the time, and I think that's what I've, in my own way, have attempted to express with this record, that in the face of loss, you have to hang on to the love, and to let that guide you forward, and propel you forward, because you can't sit and just grieve. Life has to go on, because it really is quite wonderful. The only great thing about experiencing death is to have the reminder to experience life while you're living it, and simple things like phone your mom and tell her that you love her.
It's kind of a part of the full experience.
100%, because it's a precious thing and it's a wonderful thing, and even with your buddies, with your coworkers and stuff like that, live a solid, positive life,
Well, I want to thank you for being so candid. It's
been my pleasure.
A dream come true to talk to you. So thank you so
Steve.
much.
No, thank you very much.
And Taxi Dancers is out on February 28th.
Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Okay, bro.